Tonight, we're entering ancient Rome. Not the Rome of legions and emperors, not the marble halls or the Senate floor. This is a quieter Rome, a lived-in Rome. The kind built not by conquest, but by laundry lines and public fountains. We're not chasing famous names or historical milestones. We're simply passing through a single day in the heart of an ancient city, moving slowly, observing the rhythms of ordinary life as it once was, the kind of life that filled the spaces between the events history books like to remember. So, let the noise of today slip away. Let the stone streets of another time carry you. We won't rush. We'll walk gently through a world long gone, but once full of motion and breath. If your eyes begin to close, that's all right. The city will keep going. Whether you hear every word or drift off midway, Rome will still be here. Morning in ancient Rome didn't arrive with alarm clocks or buzzing gadgets. It came slowly, like the sun, pressing itself between roof tiles and wooden shutters. The first sounds were often human, the scrape of sandals on stone stairwells, a yawn from a neighbour one wall over, the muted clatter of a shop owner unlocking their store with a wooden bar. In the insulae, Rome's apartment buildings, space was tight, and privacy was more idea than reality. Families lived one on top of another, separated by little more than mud brick and habit. Higher floors were cheaper but shakier. They swayed in storms and groaned under their own weight. Most people slept in short bursts, often waking in the early hours before sunrise. Beds were simple. Woven cords stretched across wooden frames, stuffed cloth pillows if you were lucky, wool blankets for warmth in winter, thin linen in the summer months. By the time the light filtered through, the room was already warming. Fires from bread ovens below sent smoke through the alleyways. Bakers were among the first to rise, stoking coals before the city truly stirred. Water had to be fetched. Even in a city famous for its aqueducts, individual homes didn't usually have plumbing. A child or servant might carry a jug down to the nearest public fountain, waiting in line to fill it, then lug it back upstairs. There were no showers, no private bathrooms. Washing was done in basins, if there was time. A splash to the face, hands scrubbed with sand or a rough cloth, oil for skin if you had it. The street below was growing louder. Vendors rolled out carts. Oxen clomped past with wheels behind them. Somewhere nearby, a rooster crowed, though nobody really needed it. Breakfast, if it happened, was light. A piece of bread soaked in wine, a handful of olives or dried fruit. Maybe nothing at all if the day's wages hadn't come in. There was no time to linger. The morning was for work, setting up shop, opening stalls, preparing meals, mending clothes, hauling goods. By now the sun was clearing the rooftops and the shadows were shortening. Laundry already fluttered between buildings on hanging cords, catching the first real light. Voices rose in the courtyard, and with them, the city's day began. To understand daily life in Rome, start with where most people actually lived. Not in villas with columns and gardens, but in insulae, the sprawling apartment blocks stacked like clay loaves across the city. These weren't glamorous. They were practical, crowded, and always on the edge of being too much. Rome was a vertical city, and these apartments climbed several stories high, some as tall as 6 or 7 floors. Materials, brick, wood, and plaster, often mixed with a bit too much hope and not enough structural integrity. Fires were common, so were collapses. The ground floor was prime real estate, easier to access, cooler in the summer, more stable. It often housed shops and small taverns. Families with more money might claim those lower levels for living space. The higher you lived, the poorer you probably were, and the more stairs you had to climb daily, sometimes dozens, hauling your water, firewood, and market goods with you. Rooms were small, just a few meters across. If you were lucky, there might be a window, although it rarely kept out noise or smells. Walls were shared, and so were conversations, whether you meant to hear them or not. Thin partitions meant that a sneeze 3 doors down might earn you a salve from your neighbor. Cooking indoors was risky. Fires were a constant concern, and flammable materials were everywhere. Most families either cooked over small braziers, carefully watched, or relied on street food, bakeries, or shared kitchens on the lower floors. The air inside, dense, a mixture of smoke from nearby ovens, damp plaster, human scent, and sometimes the more persistent reminder that sewers weren't always where they should be. Rome had advanced plumbing for its time, but insulae rarely benefited directly. Chamber pots were common, and discretion in emptying them wasn't always guaranteed. Still, these homes were lived in. Walls might be decorated with simple frescoes, red and black bands, geometric patterns, maybe a painted vine creeping toward the ceiling. Furniture was minimal: a wooden bed frame, a stool or two, perhaps a chest to store clothes and whatever valuables a person owned. Families shared space: parents, children, maybe a grandparent or cousin, sometimes slaves, if the household could afford them. Privacy was more an understanding than a reality. People knew when to turn away or raise their voices to give someone a moment of solitude, even in a room barely wide enough to lie down in. Courtyards between buildings served as common spaces for conversation, laundry, scolding children, and cooling off in the evening. These outdoor areas were where daily life spilled out and mingled, where someone's firewood might be borrowed, or where cats patrolled like self-appointed building managers. No one romanticized the insulae, not even then, but they were the pulsing heart of Rome's working-class life. From bakers to scribes to porters and seamstresses, this was where Rome truly lived, not on palatial hillsides, but here, elbow to elbow, one creaking floorboard away from the next person's life. In ancient Rome, breakfast wasn't a grand affair. It was humble, efficient, and usually eaten on the go or standing up, more necessity than ritual. The Romans called it ientaculum, and for most people, it wasn't much more than a pause before the real business of the day began. A typical morning meal might consist of a piece of yesterday's bread, softened in water or diluted wine. If you had a bit more to spare, you might drizzle it with olive oil or spread it with a mash of garlic and herbs. Olives were common, as were dried figs or dates left over from the previous day's market. For some, a handful of nuts or a slice of cheese could round out the offering, though these were more luxuries than staples. There were no tables piled with options, no plates of eggs and meat. In the working districts, the first food of the day was meant to sustain, not impress. Those who lived near the bakery were especially fortunate. The smell of fresh bread, panis quadratus or panis plebeus, often round and marked with deep scoring, wafted through the alleys. Sometimes you could barter for a warm loaf fresh out of the oven, and if your family had arranged ahead of time, you might have sent dough to the communal oven to be baked alongside your neighbors. Eating was rarely done in solitude. In cramped apartments and narrow streets, food was social by default. A father shared bites with his children while tightening the straps of his sandals. A mother passed out figs while braiding her daughter's hair. Even in silence, the morning meal was shared, a kind of quiet communion before the day's demands took hold. Many Romans skipped formal breakfast entirely. Street vendors sold quick bites, thin pancakes, fried pastries, or cups of warm pulse, a porridge of spelt or barley. These were often eaten by artisans or labourers already on their way to work, leaning against the side of a building or crouching beside a fountain. Wealthier citizens, of course, had more variety. Fruits imported from across the empire, soft cheeses, honey cakes, maybe even a boiled egg or cold meat from the previous evening. But this was the exception, not the rule. For the average Roman, breakfast was a means to an end. There was no ceremony, no lingering, just the rhythm of hands moving, mouths chewing, sandals tapping, and the city rising. Food gave way to labour, to errands, to shouting vendors and clattering wagons. The day had begun, and somewhere in the narrow shade between buildings, a few crumbs fell quietly to the ground, snatched up by a city cat that, like everyone else, had its morning routine. By the time the sun rose high enough to cast long, clear shadows across the narrow Roman streets, most people were already hard at work. In ancient Rome, idleness wasn't an option for the majority. Life was expensive, the city was crowded, and coin rarely stayed in one's hand for long. Labour came in many forms. There were the tradesmen and artisans, cobblers repairing sandals in open-door shops, blacksmiths hammering metal into tools or hinges, and carpenters shaping wood for carts, shutters, and furniture. Their workshops spilled into the streets, where the sound of work became part of the city's texture, a steady tap, scrape, shout, and whistle. Vendors rolled carts to the markets early. Some sold vegetables or fish, others spices, oils, or wine watered down for daily drinking. The Macellum, or market, was the epicenter of early commerce. Buyers haggled, children ran underfoot, and the air filled with smells, some fragrant, others less so. Public labourers swept streets or emptied refuse pits, thankless work, though vital. Some cleared out latrines or swept bathhouses. Slaves did much of this work, along with hauling water, delivering messages, or working the vast estates just outside the city. For many, especially the enslaved, morning blurred into midday, without much distinction. Women, too, were busy. Inside homes, they ground grain with heavy stones, kneaded dough, spun wool, or mended clothing. Those with access to a courtyard might grow herbs, tend pigeons, or dry laundry in the early light. Wealthier households had slaves for this. But even among the lower classes, work divided quickly and predictably. Teachers held lessons in porticos or rented rooms, guiding small groups of children through the basics: Latin grammar, Greek recitation, arithmetic with wax tablets. The students mumbled their lessons aloud, a method called loud reading. So if you passed a group of children all muttering at once, they probably weren't talking to themselves. Not everyone worked with their hands. Scribes copied legal documents for a fee. Moneylenders watched the forum's corners, tracking debts and exchanging coins. Couriers trotted from district to district with letters or receipts tucked in folds of fabric. And then there were the street performers, flute players, jugglers, contortionists. Not a stable profession, but an old one. Some earned enough for bread. Others earned only the occasional grown or tossed fruit. Each Roman morning followed its own rhythm, but they all shared a common urgency. Time was marked not by hours but by need, by who was waiting for their sandals, by how many loaves still had to be sold, or by how hot the sun was getting overhead. Even in a city known for excess and ceremony, the average morning was plain and full of motion. Life buzzed not in the temples or on the marble steps of the Senate, but in alleys and stalls and smoky rooms. Rome's pulse beat strongest here, in the press of work and the endless shuffle forward. Walking through the streets of ancient Rome meant navigating more than just space. It meant learning a rhythm. The city moved, buzzed, and rattled, and if you didn't learn its timing, it was easy to end up with a sandal full of something regrettable. Roman streets were narrow. Many barely allowed 2 carts to pass. Some couldn't accommodate carts at all. These alleys twisted and turned, squeezed between homes, shops, and workshops. Buildings loomed tall on either side, often casting shade until midday, their walls weathered by time, smoke, and the occasional enthusiastic vine. The streets were paved with large, uneven stones. Gaps between them filled with dirt, spilled wine, and the runoff of daily life. Raised stepping stones, strategically placed blocks that served as makeshift crosswalks, offered a way to cross when the street below was, shall we say, less than pleasant. These weren't decorative. They were practical and necessary. Carts rumbled by, their wooden wheels groaning under loads of grain, amphorae, bricks, or fish packed in salt. Horse hooves clacked, dogs barked, and every so often, someone shouted a curse loud enough to wake the local lares. Carts were only allowed during specific hours in much of the city, but that didn't stop early morning deliveries or ambitious drivers from pushing limits. The scent of bread baking mixed with the stench of refuse and sewage. Rome had sewers, most famously the Cloaca Maxima, but not every neighborhood was well connected. Chamber pots were often emptied from windows with a warning yell, if you were lucky. Cave Canem may have warned of dogs, but it was the falling surprises you really had to watch for. Vendors shouted their wares, figs, garum, sandals, charms, hot lentils in clay bowls. Some had musical calls, others just relied on volume. Street food was always available, and so were the cooks selling it, men behind large pans or clay ovens, doling out simple meals in exchange for a few worn coins. Children darted through crowds, playing with hoops or tossing dice made of bone. Stray cats prowled confidently, often more fed than some of the city's poor. Dogs of all sizes wove between legs, hoping for scraps or adventure. Graffiti covered the walls. Everything from political slogans to crude drawings to messages like, "Lucius was here," or "Beware of Marcus's cooking." Romans weren't shy about using public space for private expression. If you lingered too long near a wall, you might end up part of someone's commentary. Water flowed from public fountains, stone basins fed by the aqueducts. People stopped to wash, drink, or refill jars. These fountains weren't luxuries. They were lifelines, especially in tenement neighborhoods where private access to water was rare. Despite the noise, the chaos, and the occasional puddle of mystery, the streets were alive. They connected the city like veins, carrying food, goods, gossip, and people through Rome's pulsing heart. If Rome had a heartbeat, it thumped loudest in its markets. The clatter of coin, the sharp scent of spices, the overlapping calls of merchants hawking their goods. Together, they formed a kind of music. The Forum Venalium, or marketplace, was less a location than a living, shifting organism. Each district had its own version, from the grand central markets to neighborhood stalls tucked under wooden awnings. At the core were the food sellers. Produce from the countryside came in early. Artichokes, garlic, lentils, beans, and leafy greens piled into baskets. Chickens squawked from cages, fish glistened on wet cloth, and hunks of cheese sweated in the sun. Fruit vendors stood beside pyramids of dates, figs, and apples, trying to shout louder than the competition. A good spot in the market wasn't just lucky, it was survival. Behind the food stalls, merchants sold everything else. Clay oil lamps, cheap jewelry, small statues, sandals, ribbons, and charms meant to ward off bad luck or bad breath. For those with coin, finer goods appeared too. Dyed fabrics, imported perfumes, writing tablets, glassware from Syria. Much of it came with a story, whether true or invented on the spot. The wool, spun by temple virgins. The jar, blessed by a priest from Ephesus. The bracelet, found at sea. Today only, bartering was the norm. Haggling wasn't just expected, it was part of the entertainment. A buyer might pretend to walk away, only to be called back with a better deal. A seller might insist that a cracked amphora was weathered, not damaged, and worth twice as much because of it. Coins changed hands constantly, from bronze asses to silver denarii, each worn smooth from years of circulation. Women came in groups, balancing baskets on their hips and inspecting produce with practiced skepticism. Children followed, occasionally sneaking figs when no one was watching, or sometimes when everyone was. Slaves did much of the actual carrying, their arms laden with jugs of oil or sacks of grain. You could also find tabernae, permanent shops built into the ground floors of houses or public buildings. These offered everything from sandals to scrolls, with the shopkeeper living in a room behind the counter. Many tabernae specialized, one for bronze goods, another for dried meat, another for ointments and herbal remedies. Some even doubled as informal taverns, selling wine and bread to the tired and talkative. Amid it all moved the money changers, men seated at folding tables, counting coins, weighing metal, and offering loans with interest that grew faster than basil in the summer. Their tablets were smeared with wax and numbers, their eyes always calculating. Even the pickpockets were part of the ecosystem, slipping between crowds with practiced grace, fingers light as feathers and just as swift. The market was opportunity for everyone. By midday, the heat would begin to thicken, and the stalls closest to shade became prized territory. Sellers wiped sweat from their brows. Buyers rushed to finish before the sun became too much. Deals were struck, complaints shouted, and goods carried off in woven baskets or slung across shoulders. And by the time the crowds began to thin, the market had done its job, fed the city, clothed its people, and passed along its gossip like a well-loved heirloom. For most of Rome's population, home wasn't a marble villa. It was a cramped apartment in a tall, multi-story building called an insula. Think of them as ancient high-rises, only without elevators, plumbing, or any illusions of soundproofing. The insulae, plural, were built of brick and concrete, stacked up to 5 or 6 stories high, sometimes more. The ground floor was the most desirable, cooler in the summer, safer in a fire, and closest to the well or street-level toilets. As you climbed higher, the rent dropped and the inconvenience grew. Water had to be hauled up manually, sometimes several times a day, and in a fire. The top floor was not where you wanted to be. Inside, space was tight. A single room might house an entire family, with sleeping mats rolled out at night and stacked away each morning. Furniture was minimal. A table, maybe a few stools, a chest for belongings, and a shelf for pottery. Windows were small, often shuttered, and let in little light. Privacy was more idea than reality. Walls were thin. Arguments, lullabies, whispered gossip, all travelled easily between neighbours. If someone was boiling lentils down the hall, chances were you'd know before they added the salt. Kitchens, if present at all, were tiny alcoves with charcoal braziers for heat. Many residents simply bought hot food from street vendors or thermopolia, small shops that served ready-made meals in clay dishes. It was cheaper and, frankly, less likely to burn your apartment down. Despite the close quarters, homes were personalized. Wall hangings, clay figurines of household gods, lares and penates, and tiny oil lamps helped define a space. These weren't luxuries, they were essentials. People prayed to their household spirits for health, safety, and good grain prices. A small shelf often served as a domestic altar. Water came from communal fountains. For toilets, many insulae had shared latrines on the ground floor, though some lacked them entirely, forcing residents to rely on chamber pots and sometimes open windows. It's not a coincidence that walking close to the walls of a building was considered risky behavior. Laundry was usually done in public washhouses. These were busy social places run by full-owns, professional launderers who used everything from clay and ash to fermented urine. Yes, really, to clean garments. Clothes came back whiter, though not necessarily fresher. In the evening, neighbors might gather in the stairwells or corridors to talk, share food, or listen to someone retell the latest market gossip. Children played simple games with pebbles or bone dice. Someone always had a story about a dream, a strange omen, or a cousin who saw an actual senator once and lived to tell about it. The insula wasn't glamorous. It was noisy, crowded, and a bit precarious, but it was home. And for millions of Romans across centuries, it was where life unfolded in all its small, persistent, daily rhythms. Eating in ancient Rome wasn't about indulgence for most people. It was about practicality, survival, and routine. The lavish banquets we picture, those were for senators, elites, and the very well-connected. For the average Roman, meals were simple, repetitive, and tightly bound to what you could afford and how close you lived to a public oven. The day began with ientaculum, a modest breakfast. This might consist of a hunk of bread, maybe dipped in wine, with a fig or two if you were lucky. Honey was a prized sweetener, but it wasn't common in most households. Cheese, olives, or nuts occasionally made an appearance, but for many, the first meal was more about putting something in your stomach than celebrating flavor. Lunch, or prandium, was a step up, but still fairly light. Cold leftovers from the night before, bread with cheese or fruit, or lentils with a little oil were common. Street vendors were a lifeline, serving up beans, sausages, flatbread, or a small bowl of stew. A meal bought hot and ready was often safer and more satisfying than cooking over a temperamental charcoal brazier in a smoky room. Dinner, cena, was the main event. Not necessarily fancy, but more filling. It usually began after sunset. For poorer Romans, cena might be a porridge of grains called pulse, cooked with water and sometimes flavored with herbs, onions, or a scrap of lard. If there was meat, it was often salted, boiled, or ground into sausage. Chickpeas, lentils, and cabbage were regular guests at the table, and bread, always bread, was ever present. If someone had a few coins to spare, they might add eggs, dried fruits, or even a small fish. Salted fish sauce, garum, was the universal condiment, used the way we might use soy sauce, ketchup, or too much ranch. Made from fermented fish guts, it smelled powerful and tasted complicated, but Romans loved it, and it flavored everything from stews to snacks. Those with a bit more wealth might enjoy roast meats, seafood, and exotic spices imported across the empire. Pepper from India, cinnamon from Arabia. But for the average citizen, even a chunk of pork was a luxury reserved for holidays or special occasions. Dining customs varied. Poorer families often ate sitting or squatting around a low table. There were no individual plates, just shared dishes and fingers, maybe with a spoon if needed. Bread was your utensil. Wine was common, but always diluted with water. Drinking it straight was seen as barbaric or worse, a sign of poor self-control. Romans didn't end meals with dessert as we do, but fruit or sweetened nuts might close things out. Cakes made of dates, honey, and flour occasionally surfaced for celebrations. Food wasn't just sustenance. It was ritual, social glue, and a reflection of status. A humble meal could still be comforting, and a shared loaf of bread could bind a family more tightly than any grand feast. And as the oil lamp flickered and plates were cleared, the day's final rituals, thanks to the household gods, a quick sweep of the floor and one last check on the fire, signaled that rest, once again, was near. For ancient Romans, cleanliness was a public event and a daily ritual. While private bathrooms were reserved for the rich, most Romans relied on the great equalizer, the public bathhouse, or thermae. These places weren't just for washing. They were Rome's answer to gyms, social clubs, and local gossip mills. Bathhouses dotted the city. Some were small and modest. Others, like the baths of Caracalla, were grand, sprawling complexes with soaring ceilings, mosaic floors, and room for thousands. Entry was cheap, sometimes even free, subsidized by wealthy patrons or the state itself. It wasn't unusual to go daily, especially if you wanted to stay in the loop. A typical bath routine followed a loose order. First came the appoditerium, the changing room. You'd leave your clothes with an attendant, hopefully trustworthy, but theft wasn't unheard of. Then it was off to the palaestra, an open area for exercise. Here, bathers lifted weights, wrestled, or jogged in circles, building up a good sweat. Yes, you got sweaty before you bathed. Roman logic. Next came the hot rooms, tepidarium, warm, caldarium, hot and steamy, and finally the frigidarium, cold plunge. These rooms were heated with an ingenious system called the hypocaust, where furnaces warmed air that circulated beneath the floors and through the walls. Walking barefoot in the caldarium meant stepping carefully. Those floors could scald. In the caldarium, people oiled their bodies before scraping off the sweat, dirt, and oil with a curved metal tool called a strigil. It wasn't exactly gentle, but it was effective. There were no soaps. Cleansing meant heat, oil, and scraping. Slaves or attendants often helped with the process for those who could afford it. The frigidarium was last. A bracing dip in cold water that jolted the senses and closed the pores. Some bathers skipped it. Others swore it made them feel immortal. The final step? A massage or a rest in the lounging areas, surrounded by the low murmur of voices and the slap of sandals on wet stone. Beyond the bathhouse, hygiene habits varied. Wealthy Romans might have private toilets and even plumbing, but most relied on communal latrines, stone benches with holes flushed by running water. A shared sponge on a stick served as toilet paper. It was rinsed between uses, but let's just say it didn't linger. Dental care was rudimentary. People chewed sticks to clean their teeth, used abrasive powders made of charcoal or crushed bones, and rinsed with vinegar or wine. Cavities were rare thanks to low-sugar diets, but toothaches were a common complaint. Some chewed mint or parsley to freshen breath. Others prayed to gods for relief. Hair was another matter. Most men kept it short and neat. Barbershops, or tonstrini, doubled as social hubs where you could get a trim, a shave, and a rundown of the latest scandals. Women's hair varied. simple braids for the poor, elaborate styles and wigs for the rich, lice. A fact of life tackled with combs and resignation. Perfume, if you could afford it, was a way to mask body odors and signal status. Popular scents included myrrh, rosa, and cinnamon, luxuries carried in tiny glass bottles. Hygiene in ancient Rome wasn't perfect, but compared to many eras that followed, it was surprisingly advanced. Bathing wasn't just about being clean. It was a daily commitment to order, ritual, and community. And when you stepped out of the bathhouse, skin tingling and face flushed, the chaos of the city felt just a little more manageable. When the work was done and the baths were over, Romans turned to their true passion: entertainment. Not content with quiet pastimes, Rome specialized in the grand, the loud, and the public. Entertainment wasn't just amusement. It was an essential part of civic life. And sometimes it was downright outrageous. Let's start with the big-ticket item, the Colosseum, or Flavian Amphitheatre. This massive arena seated over 50,000 people and was the site of gladiatorial games, animal hunts, mock sea battles, and public executions. It was hot, crowded, and at times gruesome, but also mesmerizing. Gladiators, often enslaved or criminals, trained in specialized schools and fought with varying styles and weapons. Some were local favorites, with fan bases and graffiti scrawled in their honor. Others didn't last long. Tickets to the games were free. Seating was assigned by social rank, with the best spots going to senators and the worst to women and the poor. The emperor often presided over events, giving the signal for mercy or death with a wave of his hand, or so legend claims. The crowd, of course, had opinions, but Rome had more than blood sport. Theatre was a popular draw, especially in the open-air theatre. Performances ranged from Greek tragedies to bawdy farces, and actors, though not always respected, were often well known. Comedies played to the working class with physical humor and sharp wit, while tragedies leaned on moral tales and dramatic speeches. Pantomime, a mix of dance, music, and masked storytelling, was surprisingly popular. It required no dialogue, which meant even those who didn't speak Latin could enjoy the spectacle. The actor, always male, would perform all roles with sweeping gestures, while a chorus narrated or sang the tale. Then there were the ludi, public games and festivals. These events, often held in honor of gods or emperors, included everything from chariot races in the Circus Maximus to theatrical performances, athletic contests, and religious ceremonies. Chariot races, in particular, were wildly popular. The factions, blue, green, red, and white, had fan bases as intense as modern sports teams. Fistfights over race outcomes weren't uncommon. On a smaller scale, daily entertainment included dice games, music, poetry readings, and street performances. Musicians played pipes, lyres, or tambourines in taverns or public squares. Storytellers recited myths or improvised tales for coins. Wealthier homes might host private performances, readings, or philosophical debates. For children, toys included dolls, hoops, and knuckle bones, an early form of jacks. They also played games with rules remarkably close to the modern tag or hide and seek. Entertainment wasn't just for pleasure. It served as a release valve for tension, a platform for imperial propaganda, and a tool for cultural cohesion. When the crowd cheered together, groaned together, or held its breath at the same moment, it reminded everyone, rich or poor, citizen or foreigner, that they were part of the same empire. And when the sun began to set behind the city's tiled roofs and marble columns, the last cheer faded, the last song ended, and Romans filtered home, full of stories and smoke and the simple thrill of being entertained. In the life of a Roman, religion wasn't a compartmentalized affair. It wasn't something reserved for temples or festivals or Sunday mornings. It was everywhere, woven into daily routines, whispered in greetings, etched into doorposts, and baked into loaves of bread. Gods, spirits, and omens shaped everything from state policy to when you dared cut your fingernails. Roman religion was polytheistic and intensely pragmatic. The goal wasn't so much divine love as divine favor. Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods. You gave offerings, followed rituals, and hoped in return that the gods would help your harvest, protect your home, or at least not smite your roof during a thunderstorm. It was a contract, not a romance. The gods were many and specialized. Jupiter ruled the sky and state. Juno watched over women and marriage. Mars handled war, while Venus oversaw love and fertility. But alongside these headliners were thousands of lesser deities and spirits. Every tree, river, door hinge, and tool might have a spirit. The Romans didn't like to leave anyone out. Better to offer a coin or a crumb just in case. Every home had a lararium, a small household shrine, often built into the wall near the kitchen or entrance. This was where the family honored their lares, protective spirits, penates, guardians of the pantry, and sometimes deceased ancestors. A flick of wine, a pinch of salt, a whispered prayer. It was all part of keeping the household in harmony. Daily rituals began with simple gestures, washing hands, lighting a lamp, speaking a blessing. Public rituals, though, were far more elaborate. The state religion was a spectacle of priests in embroidered togas, animal sacrifices, processionals, and divinations. The Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest, was a political powerhouse. So was the Vestal Virgin, charged with keeping Rome's sacred hearth flame alive. If the flame went out, it was considered a bad omen. If the Vestal broke her vow of chastity, the consequences were severe. Omens mattered. Priests known as augurs read the flight of birds to divine the will of the gods. Haruspices examined the livers of sacrificed animals for signs. Tripping on your way to the forum, bad omen. Lightning on your wedding day. Actually, that might depend on which god you asked. Festivals filled the calendar. Saturnalia brought gift-giving, role reversals, and general chaos. It's often cited as an ancestor to Christmas. Lupercalia celebrated fertility with goatskin thongs and a bit more nudity than modern Valentine's Day. Each god had their special day or days, often tied to agriculture, war, or political memory. Interestingly, belief wasn't exclusive. Romans had no issue adopting new gods from conquered territories. Isis from Egypt, Mithras from Persia, and even Jesus of Nazareth eventually found followers in the empire. As long as your new deity didn't ask you to abandon your civic duties or skip the emperor's birthday sacrifice, you were usually left in peace. Religion was a tool, a comfort, a way to explain the unexplainable. It bound communities, gave structure to time, and reminded everyone, from emperors to olive sellers, that the world was full of forces beyond their control. And so, as incense curled into the air, as prayers murmured in quiet corners, as bells rang and flutes played in temple courts, life in Rome moved in rhythm with the gods, ever watchful, ever present, and occasionally in a good mood. To understand ancient Rome, you have to understand how much they loved food, not just for sustenance, but for celebration, status, and yes, a bit of showing off. Whether it was a quick bite at a tavern or an opulent feast in a marble-clad villa, food was central to Roman identity. Let's start with the basics. The average Roman's diet was based on a staple known as poles, a thick porridge made from spelt or barley. It could be eaten plain or jazzed up with vegetables, herbs, cheese, or whatever happened to be lying around. Bread was also a major player, usually coarse and dense, baked in communal ovens. Wheat was more prized than barley, but unless you were well off, you probably didn't see the finest grain very often. Meals were divided roughly into 3 parts. Ientaculum, breakfast, prandium, lunch, and cena, dinner. Breakfast and lunch were usually quick and practical. Bread, olives, maybe some cheese or dried fruit. But cena was the social centerpiece, especially for the wealthy. This was where things got dramatic. In an elite household, dinner began in the atrium or triclinium, the dining room, often decorated with frescoes of gods, myths, or vegetables with vaguely philosophical meaning. Guests reclined on couches around low tables. Yes, reclined. Sitting upright was for children or barbarians. The food came in multiple courses. First, the gustaccio, appetizers like eggs, salad, or dormice stuffed with herbs and nuts. Then the prima mensa, or main course, roasted meats, stews, fish dishes, sometimes something exotic like peacock or flamingo, if the host was feeling flashy. Finally, the secunda mensa, the dessert, honey cakes, fruit, sweet wine. Garum, a fermented fish sauce, was slathered on everything. It smelled how you'd expect, but Romans swore by it. It was the ketchup, soy sauce, and Worcestershire of the ancient world, all in one potent bottle. Drinks, wine, always wine, but it was almost always diluted with water. Drinking it straight was considered uncivilized, unless you were trying to make a point. Spiced wines, honeyed wines, and mulled wines were all popular, and no feast was complete without a symposium. A drinking session, sometimes philosophical, sometimes chaotic, sometimes both. In the kitchen, or rather, outside the dining room, often in a smoky corner of the home or courtyard, slaves did most of the actual cooking. Roman kitchens didn't look like modern ones. Fire pits, clay ovens, and bronze or ceramic cookware dominated. Recipes, when written down, came with vague measurements like a handful of this, or enough to please the cook. And then there were the street foods. Vendors sold hot sausages, stews, honeyed nuts, and fried pastries. Thermopolia, Roman fast food counters, lined city streets, offering warm meals for those who didn't have kitchens of their own. Picture a tiled counter with sunken pots, steam rising as workers ladled out lentils or wine. It was quick, cheap, and lively. Food was social. Food was political. Food was performative. Hosting a great banquet could boost your reputation. Botching one could ruin it. Even emperors were judged by their dinner tables. So next time you break out the Tupperware or reheat leftovers, remember, somewhere in a Roman alley, someone was doing just the same, only with a lot more garum. For a Roman, shopping wasn't a chore. It was a rhythm, a social circuit, and sometimes a performance. Markets weren't quiet places of contemplation. They were loud, layered, and full of life. The kind of place where chickens clucked under tables, bakers yelled prices before sunrise, and someone was always trying to sell you slightly more olives than you actually needed. At the heart of Roman commerce was the Forum. Every city had one. A public square surrounded by temples, government buildings, and shops. But beyond its political and religious roles, the Forum was a daily marketplace. In Rome itself, the Forum Romanum was flanked by basilicas, where merchants and bankers did business under vaulted ceilings, and streets extended out into side markets known as Fora Venelia, each specializing in goods like meat, fish, vegetables, or spices. Stalls were simple: wooden tables covered in fabric, baskets filled with fresh produce, jars of oil and wine, and bronze scales for weighing. Sellers shouted their deals, often creatively, poets of the cabbage trade. Buyers bargained openly, examining figs for softness, sniffing cheeses, or breaking bread to inspect its texture. Coins clinked constantly. The Roman currency system, as denarius, sestertius, was familiar to most, even among the poor. But barter still happened, especially in rural areas. A sack of grain might get you a pair of sandals. A goat, maybe a new tunic, depending on the goat's attitude. And speaking of tunics, clothing vendors were a staple in markets. Rolls of dyed wool, bolts of linen, and ready-made garments hung for display. Tailors often worked in the open air, trimming and stitching while customers waited. Sandal makers shaped leather to fit customers' feet right there at the stall. The market was more than groceries and goods. It was information. News traveled mouth to mouth. People gathered to gossip, hear court announcements, or catch the latest grain prices. Public criers stood at corners, reading edicts or calling out the results of gladiator matches and civic debates. For many Romans, shopping was a daily necessity. Without refrigeration, food was bought fresh, often just hours before it was eaten. Early morning trips meant better selection and cooler air. Wealthier families might send a servant to do the buying, armed with a list and a pouch of coins. But most people did it themselves. Beyond the forum, specialty shops, tabernae, lined main roads. These could be permanent spaces carved into building fronts, complete with counters and storage shelves. Bakers, butchers, perfumers, blacksmiths, and scribes all had their places. Some even had signs painted with symbols: a loaf for a bakery, a hammer for a metal worker, or an amphora for a wine merchant. Imported goods gave Roman markets a cosmopolitan flavor. Spices from India, silk from China, ivory from Africa, glass from Egypt. Trade routes extended across the empire and beyond. Ships docked in Ostia, Rome's port city, unloading amphorae packed with olive oil, wine, and garum. And of course, there were the haggling tactics, an ancient dance of raised eyebrows, exaggerated sighs, and walking away dramatically to get a lower price. Some things truly never change. So the next time you stroll through a farmer's market or complain about long lines at the grocery store, remember, the Romans were there first, weighing lentils, grumbling about prices, and wondering whether that melon was really worth 2 asses. In ancient Rome, education wasn't a given. It was a privilege, a responsibility, and sometimes a chore, much like today. But where we have school buses and parent-teacher nights, Romans had wax tablets, stern-faced tutors, and the occasional beating for incorrect declensions. The first educators in a child's life were usually parents. For boys, especially those in citizen families, this early instruction might include learning to read Latin, count using their fingers or an abacus, and memorize Roman legends. Girls, meanwhile, were more likely to be taught how to manage a household, though in wealthier families, they too could receive a formal education, particularly in reading and writing. Formal schooling often began around age 7. Wealthier children would be sent to a ludus, a basic primary school run by a literator, a teacher who oversaw the rudiments of reading, writing, and arithmetic. School typically took place in rented spaces, porticos, or even street corners. Desks were rare. Children sat on stools or the ground, hunched over their wax tablets. Writing was done with a stylus, a small pointed instrument for carving into wax. When the tablet was full, they smoothed it over and started again, Ink and papyrus existed, but were expensive, reserved for official documents and older students. Education was repetitive and memorization heavy. Rote learning reigned supreme. Students chanted aloud, recited fables, and copied texts line by line. Mistakes brought corrections, sometimes verbal, sometimes physical. Discipline was considered part of the learning process. If a student continued past the ludus, they might study under a grammaticus. This was the equivalent of secondary education. Here, students encountered Greek and Latin literature, poetry, history, and myth. Virgil, Homer, and Cicero were standard fare. Grammar and analysis mattered more than creativity. Interpretation had to be precise. The truly ambitious might study with a rhetor, a teacher of rhetoric. This was the final and most prestigious level of education, aimed at future lawyers, politicians, and orators. Lessons focused on persuasive speech, public debate, and the art of structured argument. Students practiced declamations, imaginary legal or political speeches designed to sharpen their wit and control their delivery. Greek was essential. It was the language of high culture, philosophy, and the eastern provinces. Educated Romans were expected to be bilingual, and many tutors were Greek slaves or freedmen who carried centuries of Hellenistic knowledge with them, but literacy wasn't universal. Many Romans, especially in rural areas, never learned to read or write. Still, inscriptions were everywhere, on monuments, temples, tombs, shops. A basic ability to recognize names, numbers, and simple phrases gave people access to essential information, even if they weren't fully literate. Libraries existed, though they weren't public in the modern sense. The most famous was the Library of Alexandria, but Rome had its own, including the Palatine and Ulpian libraries. These held scrolls, not books, and were frequented by scholars, poets, and officials seeking legal texts or rhetorical references. Education was deeply tied to class, gender, and status. But the idea of cultus, refinement through learning, was central to Roman identity. To be educated was to be civilized, and to be civilized was, of course, to be Roman. So picture a young student, hunched over a wax tablet, muttering lines from Virgil under their breath, while the teacher eyes them sternly. Outside, the sun rises over tiled rooftops. Inside, another generation of Romans slowly builds the foundation of their future, one carved letter at a time. For all their seriousness about law, discipline, and empire building, Romans were deeply committed to the art of leisure. In fact, they may have perfected it, whether it was cheering wildly at the arena or spending a full afternoon gossiping in the bathhouse. A Roman day off was rarely a quiet affair. Let's start with the obvious, the spectacles. Nothing says relaxation in the Roman context quite like watching gladiators try not to die. The Colosseum, Amphitheatrum Flavium, as they knew it, was the crown jewel of public entertainment. Tens of thousands would pack into its vast stone seating, categorized neatly by social rank. Senators sat in the front. Women and slaves were tucked far above. Events ranged from animal hunts in the morning, think lions, tigers, and imported hippos, to midday executions, and then gladiatorial combats in the afternoon. The crowd roared, vendors sold bread and wine, and while the brutality was very real, so was the pageantry. Gladiators were celebrities, trained, marketed, and occasionally mourned when they fell. But not every Roman craved blood sport. The theatrum, or theatre, offered drama, comedy, and political satire. Playwrights like Plautus and Terence filled the stage with clever servants, pompous masters, and mistaken identities. Some plays were wholesome, others not so much. Either way, the crowds loved them, especially when the jokes poked fun at elites. Then there were the ludi, public games and festivals sponsored by wealthy magistrates or emperors. These could span days and include races at the Circus Maximus, mock sea battles in flooded arenas, and parades through city streets. They were costly, extravagant, and deeply political, buying public favour one chariot lap at a time. Not every Roman had the time or energy for grand spectacles. For the average citizen, leisure was more humble. A stroll through the forum, a chat with a friend, or a visit to the thermae. The public baths, the bathhouses. These were the beating heart of Roman leisure culture. Open to most citizens for a modest fee, the baths were more than a place to get clean. They were social hubs. You could soak in hot or cold pools, enjoy a massage, grab a snack, exercise in the palestra, or even catch up on gossip and politics. The layout was ritualistic. Undress in the apoditerium, warm up in the tepidarium, sweat it out in the caldarium, and cool down in the frigidarium. There were attendants, oil for cleansing, and strigils for scraping the skin. Conversation flowed freely, sometimes loudly, and no topic was off limits. Home leisure existed too. Wealthier Romans had horti, walled gardens with shaded benches and decorative fountains. They read scrolls, played board games like latrunculi, or listened to poetry recitations by candlelight. Wine flowed generously. So did conversation, often mixing philosophy, politics, and the occasional insult disguised as wit. Children played with dolls, hoops, and knucklebones. Musicians performed in the streets. Jugglers, mimes, and street poets entertained for coins. And if you were lucky enough to have a day with no obligations, you simply enjoyed the sun, sipped watered wine, and pretended not to notice your neighbour's goat chewing on your laundry. So while Roman life could be harsh, disciplined, and uncertain, their approach to free time was almost revolutionary. They believed leisure had a purpose. That time to relax, socialize, and enjoy beauty wasn't frivolous. It was necessary for a balanced life. A good Roman didn't just work hard. They relaxed hard too. To truly understand Rome, not the empire, but the living, breathing city, you have to step into its markets. Not the glimmer of gold in palaces or the marble halls of senators, but the chatter, clink, and shuffle of daily commerce. Because at its heart, Rome was a marketplace, a noisy, dusty, jostling place where everyone had something to sell, something to trade, or something to argue about. Let's start with the Forum. Not just one place, but many forums dotted Roman cities and towns. The Forum Romanum in the capital was a centre of politics, religion, and ceremony, but also, in its side alleys and peripheral corners, a place of trade. More local markets, the Macellum, were where average Romans did their daily buying and bargaining. Vendors arrived early, their carts creaking with vegetables, fruit, salted fish, cheap wine, clay lamps, and textiles. The produce came from small farms or villa estates outside the city, brought in by donkey or barge, stacked in baskets and amphorae. You'd see figs, olives, onions, chickpeas, and seasonal specialties like pomegranates or melons, but nothing came with a price tag. Everything was negotiable. The air buzzed with voices, offers shouted, coins counted, complaints made. Children ran underfoot. Dogs sniffed at fallen cabbage. A woman tested the firmness of a pear. A man inspected a bolt of linen with exaggerated squints. Everyone was trying to get a better deal than the person next to them. Currency was mainly in bronze, silver, and the rare gold coin. The as, sestertius, denarius. Each had its value, its weight, and its place in the pocket of every buyer and seller. Larger purchases, say land or slaves, required more formal transactions, often conducted with scribes or witnesses, but a bundle of leeks or a set of sandals, that was done with a nod and a handful of change. Some trade operated on credit. Shopkeepers kept tablets with customers' debts marked in wax or ink. Reputation mattered. If you were known to pay late or never, it could follow you from stall to stall like a bad smell. Shops or tabernae lined the main roads and clustered near forums. These were narrow, open-fronted spaces where the shopkeeper often lived in a back room. You might find cobblers tapping nails into sandals, potters arranging wares, barbers trimming beards, or food vendors stirring pots of lentil stew. The smell of fried fish mingled with crushed garlic, old wine, and wet stone. Services thrived too. Scribes offered to write letters. Barbers doubled as minor surgeons. Moneylenders set up shop near temples, offering loans with interest that varied from generous to criminal. And then there were the hawkers, men and women who walked the streets shouting their wares. Need a cheap cloak, a hairpin, a quick snack. They had you covered, as long as you didn't mind the shouting. Sometimes the same pitch repeated from dawn until dusk. For the elite, the business of daily life looked different. They sent servants or slaves to the market. They negotiated property, trade routes, and political favors instead of vegetables. But even they relied on the bustling economic machine that ground along just outside their marble walls. And at the end of the day, when stalls were packed up and shutters drawn, the streets were swept, the debts noted, and the city exhaled. Because tomorrow, the market would buzz again. Rome was built by more than emperors and architects. Beneath the marble and mosaic, it was shaped by hands, calloused, ink-stained, blistered, and burned. The hands of craftsmen, labourers, and tradespeople formed the true heartbeat of the city. You could walk a single street and pass by the results of a dozen trades, each one essential in its own quiet, dusty way. Let's begin with the potter. In a shaded workshop near the edge of town, he spins his wheel. Clay, dug from nearby fields, is worked with water and pressure until it rises, shapeless to graceful. Bowls, cups, amphorae, and oil lamps. Items so common, they often go unnoticed, but vital in every household. Once shaped, the pottery is set out to dry, then fired in a kiln that fills the alley with smoke and the acrid scent of singed earth. Down another lane, the blacksmith works. His forge glows hot. The rhythmic clang of hammer against metal echoes through the morning air. He shapes nails, hinges, tools, and sometimes more delicate items, brooches or jewelry for the wealthier clients. The work is relentless, physical, and often dangerous. Sparks jump from the anvil like fireflies with poor manners. A few doors down, the weaver's shop hums. Vertical looms hold strands of wool or flax, and deft fingers shuttle thread back and forth, creating tunics, cloaks, and cloth for trade. Dyes, some from plants, others from costly imported minerals or even crushed sea snails, add colour, though for most Romans, clothing leaned toward the practical and pale. Tanners work in the worst parts of town, by necessity. The smell of urine, animal hides, and fermented liquids is overwhelming. But the leather they produce is used everywhere. Sandals, belts, armour, and bindings. It's dirty, thankless work, but it pays. If you pass by a carpenter's stall, you might catch the scent of cut wood and beeswax. From basic stools to ornate furniture for villas, the carpenter shapes pine, cedar, or imported hardwood into practical art. Even the humble ladder or wagon wheel starts here, with careful measurements and blunt tools honed sharp. In the shadow of the temples, sculptors and stonemasons chip away at limestone or marble. Statues, inscriptions, fountains, all emerge slowly, dust-covered and precise. Every capital atop a column, every carved eagle on a gate, was once a block dragged in from a quarry and left in the sun to wait. Trades extended beyond the physical. Teachers, often enslaved Greeks, offered lessons in reading, rhetoric, and mathematics. Scribes etched contracts and letters with wax or ink, hired for their literacy in a world where many could not read. Midwives, healers, and herbalists worked in whispered circles, passing down knowledge of plants and remedies. Apothecaries mixed salves for wounds, powders for fever, or paste for insect bites. Much of it was guesswork. Some of it worked. Most of it at least smelled impressive. Each worker depended on the next. The potter needed the carpenter for kiln repairs. The weaver needed the blacksmith for loom parts. The baker needed the miller, who needed a farmer, who needed tools from the forge. And while the senators debated and the soldiers marched, these trades kept Rome alive, not with grandeur, but with grit. While Roman life often demanded discipline, labour and routine, it also made room for noise, spectacle, and the occasional over-the-top afternoon. Entertainment wasn't a side dish. It was baked into the culture. From humble street performers to blood-soaked gladiator bouts, Romans knew how to fill a day with drama, laughter, and just a touch of chaos. Let's begin with the grandest of arenas, the amphitheatre. The most famous, of course, was the Colosseum in Rome, a colossal oval of stone and shadow. But nearly every major city had its own version. These spaces weren't just for entertainment. They were demonstrations of state power, civic pride, and the Roman ideal of control over man, beast, and nature. On game days, crowds gathered early. Admission was free, sponsored by emperors or wealthy elites eager to curry favour. Seating was assigned by status. Senators in the front, women and the poor up high, slaves in the shadows. The shows, brutal. Gladiators fought animals, each other, and sometimes elaborate battle reenactments were staged with hundreds of performers. It was theatre, politics, and violence rolled into one, designed to distract, impress, and assert Rome's might. But most Romans didn't spend their days at the Colosseum. For many, leisure was found in more modest ways. Take the Thermae, the public baths. These weren't just places to wash, but sprawling social hubs. Picture a gym, spa, library, and cafe combined. After work, citizens flocked to these bathhouses to soak in heated pools, sweat in steam rooms, and gossip in the open courtyards. Philosophers debated, merchants brokered deals, and friends caught up while scrubbing themselves with olive oil and strigils. Street entertainment was everywhere. Musicians played lyres, flutes, or cymbals. Jugglers and acrobats performed tricks for coins. Storytellers spun tales of heroes and monsters to small crowds in the forum's quieter corners. And for the truly curious, fortune tellers offered vague promises of fame, fortune, or romantic fulfillment, for a price, of course. Theatres presented plays, comedies, tragedies, and farces, often adapted from Greek originals. The audience could be rowdy. Booing was common. So was cheering at crude jokes or mocking unpopular performers. It wasn't refined, but it was real. Chariot races were the other major event, held in the circus, like the Circus Maximus in Rome. These were wild, dangerous affairs. Teams represented different factions, reds, greens, blues, and whites, and fans were fiercely loyal. Crashes were frequent, injuries expected. Betting was rampant. The cheers could be heard blocks away. Festivals added another layer of celebration. Rome's calendar was crowded with public holidays honoring gods, emperors, or historical events. Streets filled with food vendors, music, and processions. Some festivals involved animal sacrifices, others athletic contests, and many included generous helpings of wine. And then, of course, there were the quieter pleasures. Sitting on a shaded bench, sharing bread with a friend, listening to a flute drifting in from a neighbour's window, watching pigeons squabble in the dust near Temple Column. In a world where life could be short and unpredictable, Romans made space for enjoyment, whether by watching a fight, soaking in warm water, laughing at a play, or just lingering in the sun. They found their moments, not always dignified, but always Roman. As the Roman day wound down, the city did not fall silent, but it softened. Shadows stretched across the cobbled streets. Smoke drifted lazily from cooking fires, curling into the twilight. The sky, once blinding with Mediterranean sun, now melted into a palette of dusky orange and soft indigo. Cicadas sang from the edges of courtyards. Lamps were lit one by one, casting golden halos against the stone. Dinner, cena, was the final rhythm of the day. For the wealthy, it could be a spectacle. Several courses, reclining on couches, servants darting between guests with dishes of roasted dormice, stuffed olives, honeyed dates, or salted fish. Wine flowed freely, often mixed with herbs, seawater, or even resin. Conversation drifted from politics to poetry to gossip, never far from someone boasting about their garden or lamenting the new taxes. For most, however, dinner was simpler: bread, porridge, lentils, some vegetables if they were lucky, or a scrap of meat saved from the market. Families gathered around clay lamps in small, smoky rooms, sharing what they had. The food was plain, but the act, eating together, carried comfort and routine. After dinner, the streets calmed. Children, sticky with figs or ashes, were ushered inside. Merchants packed away their stalls under canvas. The clang of a blacksmith's forge faded. Bakers prepared dough for the morning, their fires glowing faintly through open archways. Some evenings ended in public spaces. Neighbours met near the fountain to chat. A storyteller entertained a circle of listeners with a tale from Homer or something more improvised. A few stragglers lingered outside bathhouses, still damp, reluctant to return to dark apartments. In temples, priests tended flames. A quiet prayer, a small offering, a fruit, a coin, a whispered hope. Religion wasn't just ritual, it was routine, a way to feel anchored in a world that often felt vast and uncertain. Above it all, the rooftops. From up there, the whole city hummed softly, a mosaic of sounds, dogs barking in alleys, laughter, footsteps, a flute far off, occasionally a shout or a baby's cry, but mostly just life, receding gently into quiet. Inside, families settled in for sleep. Beds varied, from woven mats to wooden platforms, to nothing but straw and stone. The air held the scent of oil and dust. Walls, once warmed by the day, slowly released their heat. Some fell asleep to the sound of the neighbour's snore through the thin partition. Others stared up at the ceiling, tracing cracks like constellations. The city didn't stop, but for a while it paused. And in that pause, between the extinguished lamp and the first morning vendor, was a kind of peace. Not the peace of stillness, but the peace of familiarity, of knowing the sounds, the smells, the shadows, of knowing what tomorrow will bring. Bread to bake, water to fetch, work to do. And in Rome, that was enough.